Out of the way, let's get started. I would like to introduce our three panelists for this afternoon's webinar. Dr. Andrew Lootens-White joined the Higher Learning Commission in 2007 and has recently served as both the Chief Operating Officer and Vice President for Accreditation Relations. Dr. Lootens-White is the HLC staff liaison to over 100 colleges and universities, and also provides leadership and guidance related to HLC's online assurance system and HLC's annual conference program. He served previously as both a faculty member and academic leader at the University of Missouri and with the Missouri Department of Higher Education. He holds a Ph.D. in instructional technology or instructional theory and practice from the University of Missouri. Dr. Mac Powell serves as Senior Vice President of the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities. Prior to joining the commission, he served as president of 3 universities, including John F. Kennedy University. Dr. Powell has served as chair of the American Council of Education's Commission on Educational Attainment and Innovation, a commissioner on the Western Association of Schools and Colleges Senior Commission, and chair of the Council of Applied Master's Programs in Psychology. Dr. Powell holds a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Missouri. There's a Missouri theme going here. And Dr. Kevin Sightler is Director of Substantive Change at the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges, SACSCOC, where he and his team manage all substantive change reviews, including new academic programs, off-campus instructional sites, consolidations. Kevin joined SACSCOC in 2014. He holds his Ph.D. in Industrial Management from Clemson University and has been a faculty member and academic leader at both Kennesaw State University and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We'd like to now give each of our speakers an opportunity to introduce their separate commissions, starting with Mac Powell.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities and our overall orientation. So as you can see in the slide, we serve 7 states, about 136 member institutions. We have 11 staff members, 17 board members, and we've recently revised our standards. We had 5 standards and we reduced them to 2, really highlighting our focus on student learning and student success. Our review process has shifted slightly as a result of that. We have a 7-year accreditation cycle with a mid-cycle focused on assessment and comparator institutions, a year 6 offsite review now, which deals with more of the federal compliance issues. And so therefore, when a team shows up in year 7, they're really focused almost exclusively on student success initiatives. So we define student success in terms of learning and achievement. You can find out more about our standards at nwccu.org. Very excited to be on this panel today. I know Andrew and Kevin quite well as institutional accreditors. We have collaborated for many times, and I hope that this is an example of collaboration among accreditors as we facilitate collaboration among institutions. Welcome.
Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Kevin Sightler from SACSCOC. Oh, sorry, Andrew Lootens-White from the Higher Learning Commission. I have my names out of order.
That's no problem. We'll roll with it. Happy to be here, everybody. Again, my name is Andrew Lootens-White, Vice President of Accreditation Relations at the Higher Learning Commission. As Vicki mentioned, I had previously served as Chief Operating Officer and been at the Commission since 2007. You'll notice some similarities and some differences across the agencies as Mac, Kevin, and I talk briefly about our agencies, and then I think you'll see a lot more similarities as we talk about the issues that we all manage in our different areas that we work with. So in terms of the Higher Learning Commission, we have traditionally had a 19-state region where we currently are situated. There are some federal changes that have introduced a host of other possibilities for the future across accreditation agencies, but we work currently with 967 member institutions, and we have a staff of 58 people who work to serve those institutions. We have a peer review core of just over 2,000 individuals, and these are faculty and staff and other leaders from institutions, as well as public members who work on face-to-face visits, panels that are handled virtually, and different decision-making groups. And this is one area that is a little different for us, I think, in that we have a 19-member board plus a decision-making group called the Institutional Actions Council. And that's a special focused group of peer reviewers who are enabled by our own policy to make certain kinds of accreditation decisions. So our board has offloaded some of the more routine kind of decision-making to a specialized core of peer reviewers to facilitate more expeditious handling of those decisions. We have 5 criteria for accreditation, and we also just finished a multi-year revision process, and I actually led that across our staff. It's something where we seek out input from our member institutions over that 2-year period, working with drafts, and then zeroing in and tightening in on the language that all of the members eventually guide us toward. In terms of how we do our work, the review cycle that we have is a 10-year accreditation cycle, where at the end of that 10 years, institutions come forward to have their accreditation reaffirmed, or renewed is another way I think of thinking of that. That happens in year 10, but we have a mid-cycle, as other agencies often do. Ours is in year 4, and usually that's a virtual review for some institutions. That is also face-to-face, as the year 10 is in all cases. We have substantive change panels and visits, and these are substantive changes where institutions are seeking permission to expand beyond what they're currently approved to do. So if they want to add a new location, maybe a new degree program, or switch to an online modality or a higher level of that online modality, that is what we call a substantive change. And so, like the other agencies, we have processes to manage that across the scale of institutions that we have. We also need to follow up with institutions occasionally, and that is happening through follow-up monitoring, and those take a couple different forms. The 2 biggest areas are interim reporting, where an institution after a certain time period sends us a report that we review and to monitor their progress on certain issues, or for more in-depth analysis and review, we have focused visits where we send a small peer review team to the campus to do a face-to-face review. We also collect data annually from our institutions. That's called the annual institutional update. And we run those numbers that we get, we run those through different algorithms that we have, looking at both financial aspects and then non-financial aspects. So looking at budgetary issues, but then also looking at growth or decline in terms of student enrollment, faculty body, and so forth. Lastly, I think as all accreditation agencies do, we also unfortunately have to handle advisory and sanction related reviews as needed. Those are few and far between, but that's one of the reasons that we're here, is to help institutions in those situations hopefully improve and kind of get back on the right track. I think at this point, I'll hand it back to Vicki to transition us along the way.
Thank you. And our final accreditor and crediting body that we'll hear from is Dr. Kevin Sightler.
Thank you, Vicki and Mac and Andy. Very happy to be here with you today to talk about, again, what we do at a commission level for all of our institutions, and then in particular, how we handle certain initiatives from the institutions that are involved in collaborations. To give you a brief overview, as the others have, of SACSCOC, we accredit institutions predominantly in the 11 southeastern United States, from Virginia to Texas and places in between, and also a few institutions that are located outside of the United States. We currently have 781 member institutions, plus several candidate institutions. Those institutions serve currently about 5.5 million students. SACSCOC member institutions and their additional locations are in about 10,000 locations in 47 of the US states, plus about 60 countries outside of the US. That seems to grow every day with additional locations. So those are all handled through substantive change, which is what we'll talk about, part of what we'll talk about today. SACSCOC is governed by a 77-member board, and all authority for approvals are vested with that 77-member board. The members are elected from the membership. They are representatives from institutions as well as public members. And because we have ongoing work that is subject to approval, we have an executive council of the board that meets every other week, pretty much year round, to handle, among other things, substantive changes. As the other 2 accreditors have discussed, we do have periodic institutional level reviews. They are on a 10-year reaffirmation cycle and an interim review at the 5th year. Those are reviews that are predominantly driven by time. Event-driven reviews or ongoing reviews pretty much fall under the aegis of substantive change. And we do about 3,000 or so of those reviews annually that require either notification to SACSCOC or approval by its board. And some of those do include collaborations or cooperative academic arrangements or consortia with other institutions and entities. And that'll be the basis of the rest of our discussion. Vicki?
Thank you all. We're going to move to a couple of key questions that we have asked the panelists to lean in on and give their responses to. And then we're going to throw it open to the audience. So remember, you can type your questions in the Q&A. We do have some questions that were submitted in advance as well. So let's begin first. And the question is, what do collaborative organizations need to know about accreditors' engagement with consortia?
Vicki, I'm glad to take a stab if that's okay with you. All right. I guess I have a couple different points, 3 or 4 that I'd like to make, and interested to see Kevin and Mac's responses from their perspectives as well. One of the first things I think is really helpful to understand, given the diverse number and types and sizes of institutions that we work with, I've found that oftentimes folks from institutions use the word consortium or consortia in different ways. And that's good. It's a collaborative approach. We're trying to share resources, improve quality, and help students, but it's totally fine. What the trick point or the tripping point oftentimes is, I think, when talking with an accreditor, is we have fairly official descriptions of what a consortium actually is. And so from our standpoint, and this is contrasted with contractual relationships, which I'll just touch on briefly here in a minute, so you know the difference between the two. But in terms of a consortium, from an accreditor standpoint, to us, that means an arrangement in which an accredited institution is reaching out with one or more other accredited institutions to share academic resources for the benefits I mentioned earlier in terms of financial benefits, better access and quality for students, more efficient way of offering their programs. A contractual relationship, by contrast, is typically with a non-accredited organization. So it might be that let's say your local 2-year institution is working with a paramedic service for some of the more technical aspects of a program regarding the work that paramedics do. Well, that paramedic crew in that company that manages that certainly may very well have different regulatory things that it's following, but they're not a higher education institution. And so that would be something we consider a contractual relationship. The federal government has different expectations in terms of working with contractual partners in that way, in terms of even the limits of how much of the academic program that they can provide. So, my understanding is that there are lots of different kind of collaborative relationships that everyone here at this conference would be interested in, including consortium and contractual relationships. But I wanted to make sure that we differentiated between those so that we had that as a starting place. The other piece, and maybe we can come to this later when we get into the Q&A piece, is that there are a number of what I will call for-profit brokers who are helping facilitate the sharing of academic resources across institutions, and these can be very helpful for a variety of reasons. I've seen instances, though, that cause us to pause a little bit and pump the brakes a little bit. There are times when these types of services, which again can be very helpful for institutions, when they start to look more and more like an institution of higher education themselves, it can be a little tricky. So I've seen instances where some of these third-party consortial brokers begin to have a chief academic officer. They're the ones kind of driving curricular change or those kinds of things that are traditionally left for the faculty body at the institutions that we accredit. So that's something to keep in mind as institutions are looking for ways to partner in creative ways. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to take more time from my partners who may want to respond to this, or my panelists as well.
Thanks, Andy. I'll jump in real quick. So I think that you've led us off very well. I've put in the chat box our institutional policies related to contractual relationships. And, as you shared, the world is changing. Collaborative relationships are not what they used to be. I was just kind of taking a look at our policy before we got on this conversation. And, it was last revised in 2010. I mean, the world has changed slightly in the last 10 years, I would say, and perhaps even more in the last 7 or 8 months. So I think that, as we collectively as a staff are kind of discussing, what is our orientation toward collaborative relationships? And, Andy, I want to just echo that from our point of view, the first question we're looking at is, does it serve students well? What are the outcomes? I think the second question we're asking is, what's the role of faculty? Do faculty continue to play a chief role in the instructional design if it's going to be academically based? And I think the third question that I think about coming from WASC in California, where we saw a lot of these contractual relationships being tested over the last 15 or 20 years is, what's the financial impact to both parties? What is once the contract is executed, what does it mean for the institution? What is the institution in terms of an institution? Does its structure differ? Is its governance different? So those are at least 3 considerations that I think about when I review substantive change related to a contractual relationship, and look forward to Kevin's comments.
Thank you both. When I do talk with other accreditors, it's a little surprising to me every time in a certain way as how differently we approach some things. Our means may be different, but the ends are the same. And for any type of consortia or collaboration, the end goal is always for assurance of the quality of the instruction and the learning experience of students. How an institution chooses to construct that within some limitations and parameters is really up to the institution. So if we look at the question that's on the screen there, what do institutions need to know about what accreditors' requirements or expectations are for consortia? In addition to what Andy and Mac have pointed out, there are, and they do of course vary across accreditors, it does create obligations for the institutions to have some interaction at times with their institutional accreditor. For SACSCOC, that may be a simple notification that just says, we are going to engage in this type of relationship with a partnering institution or another entity, or it could be subject to approval. Again, that's all done by our board, and that is done through a prospectus with the staff review and then with the concurrence of the executive council or the full board of trustees. We do ask that you put these relationships in some type of written memorandum. The form is entirely up to you. It's not a legal document, but we want to see if you're engaging in these types of relationships, again, for assuring the quality of the learning experience for students, that there is ample planning and responsibility by the institution so that the institution, regardless of how instruction or learning is delivered to students, assures the quality and the integrity of the instruction and any credential that's awarded invariant to those types of relationships. So those types of engagements are encouraged, and we take an oversight view, again, for the protection and the benefit of the students. I would like to pick up on one thing that Andy mentioned, and that is the entities that oftentimes are seeking to engage with our institutions in delivering some type of instruction or other learning experience. There are a lot of players who are out there, and the players vary in quality. And so for institutions that are considering this, my only guidance would be take a long, hard look at the partner and what they are able to deliver and what the expectations are on both sides of the equation to assure that you're partnering with a quality institution or an entity, again, to benefit the learning experience of your students. We talk to institutions all the time, and they tell us things that they're considering doing. We can't give them advice. It is not our role to give them advice on the advisability of a certain type of engagement or partnership or anything else they're doing at a strategic level. But sometimes the ones that we do talk to and the entities that they are in discussions with, there are some bad players out there. And it's not our role to point that out, but it is our role to say, you have an obligation for pretty substantial due diligence before you enter these relationships to assure that these institutions are going to deliver what you expect them to deliver, and it doesn't put your institution or your students in peril.
Really great points. Thank you. Thank you all. Going to move to the second question. Has accreditors' engagement with institutions and consortia changed over time, and if so, how?
I'll dive in. I'm not shy. So one of the things that was so exciting when Vicki reached out to ask, hey, we've got this conference coming up. We're really interested in hearing changes that our accreditors have going on with regard to consortia and collaborative activity like this, it was not unnoticed to Vicki and her colleagues that the Higher Learning Commission had made some changes recently to our own policies. And this goes back probably more than 10 years where, and I'll speak just for the Higher Learning Commission, we were growing very concerned about some of these other actors that we've talked about, but also in terms of some of the contractual activities. These are the opportunities which can be extremely high quality and very legitimate, but working with those paramedic companies or the flight school, those non-accredited entities that are working with accredited colleges and universities. We knew that there was some concern that the federal government had about tuition dollars, flowing eventually to non-accredited institutions. And so the federal government had some expectations about oversight that they asked accreditors to implement. Going back about 10 years, I think that for our agency, the Higher Learning Commission, we applied a less stringent view, but certainly one to consortial activity as well. Now, fast forward through the last 10 years, we've gone through, just even in the last 15, different financial crises and now we're in a pandemic and all sorts of things are going on, particularly not the least of which is the reduction in funding for public institutions, for example, or institutions that receive federal financial aid. So we realized it was really time at the Higher Learning Commission to review that requirement, that expectation for consortial pre-approval, basically, before those went forward. We looked at this and we realized, wait a minute, our concern was never with consortial arrangements to begin with. It was really with contractual institutions. And so we eliminated this past February of 2020, we eliminated our requirement to pre-approve consortial activity. And the reasons really are just a small number, and I'll tell them to you now. One is it was really time to encourage those quality collaborations, even setting aside the pandemic. This was underway at HLC even before the pandemic hit here in the United States. There was significant financial stress going on with institutions that were really enduring very long. And so we knew that this was putting great stress on academic resources, and we needed to look at this. We also knew that it can result in higher quality as institutions focus on their strengths and then connect with other institutions who have strengths that can help match and fill the gaps that are there. And then by definition, consortia, both the federal definition and at least the Higher Learning Commission's definition, are between and among already accredited institutions. So if we're already putting that stamp or seal of approval on that institution and their academic offerings, why would we be concerned, especially when most of the collaborations are largely within our own agency? Now, we do have cross-agency collaborations, and we certainly want to encourage those as well. So really, to recap here, the consortia were really never an HLC concern. I think it was something that kind of came along for the ride with the scrutiny that the federal government was asking, at least the Higher Learning Commission, I assume other accreditors as well, to apply to those contractual partners. So we were really happy, I think, to kind of free up a little bit of a logjam. It wasn't a huge one, but it really, I think, sends a strong message that, look, this is what we want to encourage. We don't want to add additional steps for institutions that are already accredited, already in good standing, to work with each other, regardless of who their accreditor is. I'll leave it at that and turn to my co-panelists for their thoughts on this particular question.
Yeah, I think that's, let me pick up and I'll just give you 3 examples of how we've adapted almost in exactly the same way. The first is when I came aboard, I would get a call from the state of Idaho probably twice a week from someone within the system of Idaho trying to figure out how they could collaborate better and how our standards were an impediment to that. So we revised our substantive change process so that institutions could transfer degrees, they could collaborate with credit, they could sign consortia, dual degree arrangements much easier, credit for prior learning. So we've tried to adopt our policies to adapt to what systems of higher education want to do, particularly public systems. I'd say the second example is from the state of Oregon. So Oregon has been a relatively collaborative state over the last 20 or 30 years. And accreditation has in some ways been an impediment. So there's a group of consortial institutions that wants to collaborate, particularly on general education and early transfer credit, which is an important initiative in the state of Oregon. And I got a call from about 3 institutions simultaneously in the same week that said, are we really going to be able to do this? And from our perspective as an accreditor, getting back to Kevin's perspective, it's about the students. And so if this initiative serves students, if the educational quality is high, why would we be an impediment to that? We revise our processes to support the consortia opportunities that institutions are making available to their students. And then finally, third, I just want to highlight something that we have in partnerships with SACSCOC, who is going to take over the next part of this conversation, which is that we think that data-informed decision-making is something that we can do better at. So we have consortia of institutions sharing data with the Post-Secondary Data Partnership. And we have another data consortia that's happening in our region as well. But we think that not only is it on the teaching side, on the credentialing side, we also think that just decision-making can be a lot better if we are more collaborative with our sharing of data. So we're grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation who have supported that work, and grateful to SACSC who have joined us. So thanks for the opportunity to share.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some great things that come out of that. And one could be looking at what we require and why we require it, and take a good hard look at that to see, are we standing in the way of institutions? I think, for speaking for SACSCOC, I think we don't have particularly onerous or burdensome requirements for that. Institutions collaborate all the time. They never rise to the level of anything that would involve their accreditor on a routine basis. And that could be things as simple as transfer articulation agreements, or ease of registration or cross-registration across institutions. Those are largely institutional issues that never rise to the level of something that SACSCOC would want to take a look at. Of all the collaborations, though, I think it's important to point out that there's a pretty wide range of involvement across all of those types of collaborations, from minimal involvement, such as dual and joint degree programs, which are usually very straightforward, to what Andy, I believe, called contractual relationships, where the institution is engaging with another entity to provide instructional content. It still has to be under the control of the institution, but it is essentially contracting that instructional services and expertise to their member institutions, or to another entity. That's a very different type of engagement, and certainly one that requires a higher level of review and scrutiny by the accreditor, again, for the purpose of quality assurance. How these have changed over time, my experience with SACSCOC only goes back about 6 or 7 years. I can tell you in that amount of time, I haven't seen a lot that has changed at the federal level in terms of expectations that institutional accreditors have over the institutions that they accredit. More recently, we have tried to take some of the different configurations that can fall under the heading of consortia or contractual relationships, and try to simplify those a little bit. In fact, one is coming out very soon that does sort of drop some of these terms is being used differently in favor of some slightly more concise language. Again, because we realize there are so many configurations and combinations and permutations that these types of relationships and consortial engagements can take, that we try to address them more globally rather than prescriptive mandates as to what should and shouldn't be, or can and can't be included in those types of engagements.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. And reminding people again, please feel free to type any questions in the question and answer. Our last big question for the panel: what is your accreditation agency's orientation towards collaboration? And are there any examples that highlight the value of collaboration from your point of view?
I'll pop in and just make one comment, and Andy, I think you were maybe going to add to this as well, and Mac. We are always available to work with institutions who are working through this type of collaboration to see if it indeed does create any obligations for them with respect to accreditation. We don't really advocate for collaboration. That's really not our role, but we do try to ensure that any requirements that we do have are for the purpose of adding value. And so if there are things that an institution is considering, we'll be happy to talk through those and help the institution to determine if there are any obligations that are created by that, but we can't really advocate. I get inquiries often, as I'm sure my other panelists do, from institutions that say, well, this is what we're trying to do. Do you know anyone who does that? And I'm usually reticent to do that, because I don't want it to be interpreted as an endorsement. And certainly we have no type of relationships, formal or other, with these entities and other institutions that may be providing those types of services for their students. So we do try to make sure our institutions know what is available to them. As an example, this past winter, we did a substantive change webinar called Programs Through Partnerships that lay out what some of the options and possibilities and obligations for institutions are. That's available to anyone, whether you're a SACSCOC institution or not, on the sacscoc.org webpage. If you go to Substantive Change, all of our Substantive Change webinars are available on demand and without restriction. So if you're at an institution, SACSCOC or otherwise, and want to see what some of those configurations are, I would point you to that resource. And then because these come up in so many different ways, a lot of this is topics of discussion when we have annual meetings or an institute or any other type of public event that right now, of course, are being done virtually. And we learn from institutions there and through the reaffirmation and through the substantive change process, all of the different ways these things can take form and can present themselves. We don't try, for very specific reasons, to address all the possible ways that institutions can collaborate. In fact, a good policy shouldn't do that, but stick rather with broad expectations, and then how the institution fulfills that and engages with these other entities is really up to them, if they demonstrate that they're under control and they've assured the quality of the instruction and the learning experience of the students.
Yeah, I'll just follow up. Kevin, those are excellent points. And I guess one thing I wanted to add to that is there's benefit, I think, oftentimes in looking for partners that are not like yourself, not like your own institution. And so one example would be when I spoke with my colleagues about, tell me about the different consortia that we have in the Higher Learning Commission and that you've worked with. And the most common report back was a combination of one or two or more institutions that were somewhat similar to each other. And so I'll give you a couple examples. Now, in these cases, representatives from those institutions might argue that they're not like the partner that I'm identifying, but you'll get my drift here. So, for example, Northwestern University and University of Chicago have arrangements where students from either institution can take transcripted courses. Another example, Carleton College and St. Olaf. Carleton colleges can take courses at St. Olaf, the transcripts of the Carleton course, for example, and both are small enough institutions and similar in the nature that they can benefit from course sharing, particularly in highly technical areas that may not be pervasive kinds of courses at institutions that are more of a liberal arts focus. So now, having said that, where typically institutions that are like each other are working together and sharing, I think it also would be short-sighted not to say, institutions that are actually quite different from themselves might have extra capacity in certain areas to offer a partner institution or institutions that may not have that capacity because the mission's different, the institution is very different. This is something that I learned from Rick Beyer, who does a lot of consulting with AGB. He works with institutions to really kind of understand that when you're partnering with institutions, many times to avoid, kind of cannibalizing your own collective pool of students, by looking for where your gaps are and looking for partners that are actually quite different, you can bring a strength to that. It's like jigsaw puzzle pieces fitting together, and you're really supporting both missions of institutions and being able to provide what you might have surplus capacity for, but your partner institutions may have a need for that. So my quick and simple recommendation here is to be really broad in thinking about, what kinds of collaborative relationships you might benefit from and that might benefit your students, and to avoid the temptation of just looking to institutions that are a lot like you because they're very familiar. I would encourage folks to look at institutions that are quite different and might have that capacity or that benefit that you're looking for to assist your students.
Yeah, and I had given some examples earlier, and I'm kind of looking at the chat and seeing that there's a question about trends in collaboration and on, how the increasing stress on institutions is addressing this. I think that we kind of alluded to this, that institutions have dwindling resources. And the question is, how are you going to continue to offer a high quality education with all the services, all of the programs, and still control costs? And I think that institutions are looking to share to share opportunities, system services within state systems. I think private institutions are looking to collaborate on expenses related to overhead. I think there's questions of what we can outsource related to housing, of course, of, food services, bookstores. I think institutions are trying to figure out how they can collaborate in all kinds of ways to reduce the operating overhead that in many cases challenges the institution. I think we've been seeing this over the last, certainly I've seen over the last 5 or 7 years. I think that COVID has reframed the challenge, because institutions are now, they're not local anymore. In some senses, all institutions are nationally competitive because their students are online. They can recruit from all over the country. So the question is, is that your mission? Or do you really need to be serving local students? And, what does this whole ecosphere mean? And I'd say that it means a lot of things to different institutions. But the one thing that I see as universal is you need to be really good at teaching online. I mean, I think every institution realizes that, there are institutions that have been doing this a lot longer and frankly have been doing it a lot better. And the question is, how are we going to get as an institution from where we are now to being able to teach at that level online? Do we try to build up our faculty? Do we try to build up their expertise? Do we try to bring in outsiders to do on-site online course design? Do we try to bring in adjunct faculty who have this ability? So I think that institutions are looking both inside and outside to figure out this very big challenge that I think that 99% of institutions are struggling with in the age of COVID. And our orientation as an agency is we think that institutions need to be thinking about that. They need to be asking those questions. But to Kevin's point earlier, I don't think that there's a one solution fits all. And I think that many solutions have costs associated with both financial costs and long-term costs related to governance and institutional control. That frankly, we've had one institutional closure in our region as a result of signing a collaborative agreement, which wound up not being to the financial benefit of the institution. So we're looking at it from as many sides as we can and recognizing that we certainly don't see it all because it's evolving so quickly.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a great segue to moving to some of the questions that we did have previously. And again, reminding folks, you can type those in as well. Here's one that's very specific. We have shared services agreement with other institutions for business operations, human resources, and joint, et cetera. Is this subject to accreditor review or approval? And what about shared library resources across institutions, something a lot of our members have?
I'll be glad to hop in on that one, mainly because there's probably not a week or even a day that goes by that we don't receive something from an institution where they're sharing with us as a notification of collaboration for these types of services. Maybe it's sort of back office business services, back end business services, how they are handling the business functions of their institutions. Speaking only for SACSCOC, those are not subject to review if it is for the purpose of supporting the business function of the institution. If it involves academic content, then it can rise to the level of a substantive change or an ongoing obligation as part of the institution's obligations as an accredited institution. We do see those, but those as a rule just are not something that is directly an accreditor's something that they want to review or to accept notification or to approve. Now, those things may show up in the periodic review of the institution, particularly if there are financial implications. So it's the financing of those types of obligations and relationships that can have an effect on the financial picture, the financial stability of the institution, but that's more indirect. So as a direct activity that needs to have accreditor approval, again, speaking only for SACSCOC, that's the institution's business. We don't get into that level of detail.
Okay. I have another fairly specific question. A lot of our institutions are involved in various forms of either cross-registration or course sharing agreements through their consortia. We're pondering a few different financial models for our collaboration to leverage academic resources. Does it matter whether students pay tuition to their home institution or directly to the institution from which they're taking courses? And I'll add on to this particular question, given that our accrediting bodies are no longer regional accreditors, and in fact, you could be collaborating with an institution across the street who's accredited by an organization with a geographic designation that implies they're in another part of the country. It's an area people are getting a little anxious about.
I'm glad to, go ahead, Mac, go ahead.
You know, this is certainly something that is extraordinarily complex. And for me, the first thing I hear when you approach this question is the question of aid, which is often the Department of Education is a lot more prescriptive about how the money flows than a regional accreditor is. I think that we as accreditors had for many years, particularly the 80s and the 90s, were focused on this challenge called degree mills. And what we were concerned about was that students would take credit somewhere and then they would transfer it to an institution who would grant a degree. And we couldn't necessarily track whether the credits were valid, what the student knew, how much did they pay for it. It scared us. And it really left a lot of the hallmarks of quality out. So I'd say that, you know, that this is a lingering effect of the challenges that degree mills created in the 80s and 90s is, you know, within regional accredited institutions, to what Kevin and Andy said earlier, generally speaking, we as an accreditor are pretty supportive of the relationship, how they share credit, how they transfer credit, how they grant dual degrees. As long as they're notifying us, we're pretty okay with it. When we get to non-accredited entities, that's where we look a little bit more closely because, you know, ultimately we want to know, do the students learn what they're supposed to learn? Do they become employed? Do they have post-educational, you know, post-degree successes that we would expect from any of our traditional institutions? Because I think that there's no doubt that, you know, this is an issue that's going on in all regional boards these days, which is, you know, how are accredited institutions renting out their accreditation in effect in some of these relationships? And I would say that those relationships are moving much faster than we can even consider them in a way. So it's a wild, wild west. I'd say that we're all agencies that are a product of our own history. We recognize that we needed to learn something from the 80s and 90s, and I think scrutinize these relationships with unaccredited entities when it comes to course delivery and design a little more closely because of it.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up real quickly. So yeah, really, in addition to what Max said, another consideration, it really kind of harkens back to what we talked about earlier in terms of kind of the vernacular or informal use of the term consortium or consortia. Many institutions or many just people will think, oh yeah, we're collaborating. We've got this regional group, and we can, you know, students are taking courses, and it's all great, and we're moving forward. But I also, there can be kind of unofficial consortia in that regard. So I guess by this, I mean, follow the money of where the students are paying tuition. So the question was about, does it matter where the institution, where the student is paying tuition, the home institution or the institution that's providing the actual instruction? And it comes down to, you know, who's paying the money to whom and how are things transcripted. I think traditionally one would expect in a consortial relationship that the home institution is transcribing the course as their own, and that they are handling the business relationship between the student, the business relationship from the home institution to the student, and then the home institution is arranging some, if needed, some financial arrangement with the institution that's providing the instruction. Now, if students are really invited, allowed, permitted to go directly to that other institution and then to pay tuition directly, that's where, from our perspective at the Higher Learning Commission, that's more in a transfer understanding, a transfer agreement, very legitimate. Sometimes it's more tricky in terms of financial aid for the student and that kind of thing, but it's very clear who the business relationship that the student has with his or her home institution and wherever they may be taking courses is really managed by the student directly, rather than having the home institution kind of serve as a surrogate for managing any of those behind the scenes. So this is where it comes into, you know, that vernacular use or informal use of the word consortium. it's in this case, it's the student is really kind of managing that business relationship and paying tuition directly to wherever they're taking those courses from. This is really more along the lines of a transfer agreement, a transfer understanding that many people will refer to as a consortium. But from an HLC standpoint, at least, we don't really think of that as a consortium. We're happy it's happening, don't get me wrong, but it's not quite a consortium in the traditional sense for us. It really boils down to kind of following the money, how are things transcript, and who's the business relationship with. I'll leave it at that in case, Kevin, I don't know if you have anything to add to that particular topic from SACS or not.
Yeah, I would say I think we are all dealing with this on an ongoing basis, and like you said, these collaborations are oftentimes just they are transfer articulation agreements. These are well thought out agreements amongst institutions. They have faculty oversight to assure that transfer credits are appropriate to the courses. They're not giving credit for courses that the institution itself does not offer, that they're accepting in transfer. But those aren't anything that beyond the institution's ongoing obligations for assuring quality of whatever they place on their transcript or use to satisfy a credential requirement are still under the control of the institution. So in your example is one reason why we tried to move away from multiple terms to describe these types of relationships, to say, well, it's a collaboration of some type. Now, the type of collaboration may create different obligations for you, and I'm sure you probably all accreditors do this. You have sister institutions that may literally be across the street from one another. So for a student, it literally means crossing an invisible boundary to go to another institution. And so the institutions have made those boundaries relatively invisible, maybe even non-existent across those institutions for the benefit of the student. That's an ease of registration and a transfer articulation. We wouldn't necessarily need to see that. That's something that you do in the course, the ongoing course of your running your institutions. Now, I'll tie that to an earlier question about what trends have we seen. We have certainly seen along a continuum of collaborations, from very minimal involvement such as dual degrees to collaborations with non-educational institutions that are offering a majority of the disciplinary content of a program. We have certainly seen more going toward the direction of a more involved type of collaboration. So that does require some additional review and creates additional obligations on the part of the institution. I had a conversation just this week with an institution that is considering entering a consortium, and my first question was, why don't you just transfer the credit? And their answer was to the previous question, yes, it does matter to the institution who awards the credit, because that's where the dollars flow. So of course it matters. They don't want it to be transfer credit. They want it to be their own credit. It's much easier for the students. The student may not be eligible for aid at another institution. And so, yes, it matters. And so my guidance to them was, don't let the tail wag the dog. Do what makes best sense for the student and the institution. If that means you have additional obligations for your accreditation, then you take care of it. But do what makes most sense for the institution, and then we'll figure out how to make that work within the constructs of policy or the principles that all the institutions have to abide by.
I'm going to slip in one last question that just came in, and it's fairly timely. We're seeing a lot of growth in certificate programs. And one of our audience their consortia has an interest in how they might be able to offer a certificate as a consortium. How are you looking at certificate programs these days? And is there any common understanding about what that means?
I've got the easiest answer. So there's some history with this as well. So we're all blessed by the Department of Education in a body called NASICI, and NASICI has taken particular interest in this subject, and actually cited a couple of the regional accreditors, 3 years ago, around this issue, which is how we define certificates, what we monitor, what a short-term credential is. So our oversight bodies are particularly interested in how we look at these things. From NWCCU's perspective, we try to hold very close to the federal guidelines. So if a certificate is Title IV eligible, then it has to go through our sub-change process. We review it as subject to all the policies of our agency, just like other programs.
I'll jump in really quickly to follow you, Mac, and it's the same at the Higher Learning Commission. A program is a program is a program, and so we consider a certificate a program, just as the federal government does. The tricky part, I think, with certificates is the volume of courses that you have going through there and the tuition that's supporting the infrastructure and the teaching is, some institutions may not feel that the juice is worth the squeeze on those. So one option then might be to create a host of consortia or a host of certificates of related, where you get a little bit more efficiency out of that, because some of these certificates are, the number of hours involved are so low that it's really, it's worth a lot of, it takes a lot of effort to get, get enough out of that for some institutions to probably feel like it's worth it, or they're serving enough students for that. So one might, just to look at batches of certificates. If you've got a relationship going, may as well throw in some related fields, because if you've got your agreements and your processes arranged with one or more institutions, that's the hard part. Typically, it's the teaching and instruction and the transcripting stuff that probably flows more naturally.
And I think we probably all approach this pretty much the same way. It's a degree, certificate, diploma. It's all an academic award. And so there are no additional requirements for one over other, but also no relief from expectations for one type of credential over the other. We have seen more and more so-called stackable credentials. And I don't know if that's more of a regional type of concept where let's say a degree program is unbundled into multiple serial credentials, so that a student that begins and may choose to not complete, let's say, a degree program, that they can be awarded a credential for completing, say, the first year of study in the discipline. That makes a lot of sense. Again, that's not treated any differently than any other credential as far as SACSCOC goes. Faculty have to be there. There has to be learning assurance. It has to be incorporated into the institutional effectiveness infrastructure of the institution, but it also gives institutions the ability to mark a completion when a student gets partly through a program, or for whatever reason doesn't go through as originally intended. And it also gives some milestones, some encouragement for students to go through those. That might be within institutions, or it certainly could be a collaboration across institutions.
Thank you all. I want to take this opportunity to thank Andy, Kevin, and Mac for sharing a lifetimes of experience in higher education and great depth of experience with our regional accreditors. I think that consortia are increasingly looking to the looking to the accreditors for guidance on how they can move forward. And as we had discussed in our meetings together, every pundit in American higher education speaking about how institutions will get through the corona crisis have spoken about, why don't you all join a consortium and consider to find ways you can share your resources and experiences. So I want to thank you for helping launch this conversation for ACL and the ACL members, and your very wise recommendations and suggestions. Thank you all.
Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you, Vicki.
And that will close our webinar, this first webinar. Be sure to drop in. The next session will be one of our emerging leaders sessions available to you. Thank you.